Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. Today I want to discuss the executive order signed by President Trump on the 3rd of June 2026, which essentially converted almost 10,000 civil servants into at will employees. So, in the federal civil service, people with non probationary status, people who are not they're not contractors. I'm not talking about people who are contractors. A contractor who works for the federal government really is working for an agency, for another company that's basically outsourcing them to the federal government as contractors, right? Independent contractors. Those are not the people I'm talking about. I'm talking about people who've been hired directly by the US federal government. I was hired directly by the US federal government. You can come in as a member of the accepted service, or that's which is non-competitive service, or the competitive service. I got into the federal government through both paths. So um, typically in the private sector, employees are what you called at will, right? They have at will employment, meaning the employer can hire them and fire them arbitrarily for no reason at any time. So they can hire you today and fire you tomorrow. They don't need a justification for firing you because you don't have an entitlement to your job, right? You don't have an entitlement to your job in the private sector. You're not entitled to the job. However, that's not the case in the federal government, in the federal civil service. In the federal civil service, people who are non-probationary, I'm not gonna talk about probationary right now. Probation, when they hire you in the first federal government to make sure you're a good fit, that they didn't miss anything, just to make sure they didn't miss anything in the hiring process, right? They sometimes they have a probationary period that might be 1 year, right? So it's not your job is not yet your entitlement. So I could do another video explaining the probationary period in the federal civil service, but right now we're talking about people who've passed the probation. They're hired. They've had their job for a while in the federal government, maybe 2 years. They've had their job, and so they're non-probationary. Now, under the law, and it was solidified through this law through a court case, a 1974 court case, I believe, Arnett versus Kennedy, which said that a civil servant has a property interest in their position, so they have an entitlement in it, right? So if you have an entitlement in something, if you're entitled to something, then you're also entitled to due process. So that's the difference between federal civil servants, so, right, who have a property interest in their jobs versus people who are at will. Federal civil servants in the US federal government, right, they have a property interest in their job, which gives them an entitlement, right? So two elements, an entitlement, they're entitled to it, just as you're entitled to Social Security. Social Security is an entitlement benefit. So the same thing as your federal government job if you're a federal civil servant. Um, and then the other thing is because you're entitled to it, you have what's called due process. So if the federal government is going to try and take your job from you, then they owe you due process because they can only remove you for just cause, right? Or in another way to put it, for cause which may lead to the efficiency and improvement of the federal government, right, of the civil service. So they can only remove you for just cause. They can't fire you arbitrarily. And if that should ever occur, you're entitled to due process, right? You're entitled to due process, even in um, with respect to other property that we have in the U.S., right? You can own a house, you can own a car, but the government you're entitled to it, right? You paid your money, it's your property, but the government can take it from you, right? You know, if you own property and government wants to build, they want to build a road, a railway through your area, through your home, right? And your house is impeding it, right? They can take control of it, right? They can take it from you through eminent domain, right? But they have to give you money for it. They have to give you all sorts of stuff, right? If you committed a crime, if you committed a crime, and you're owing, the government fines you for that crime, and then they can seize your property, right? But it's through a legal process. It's through a due process. So you're entitled to due process. The same thing with your job. So you're entitled to your job. So if the government's going to take your job from you because you have a property interest in it, that's the federal government job. That's a good thing, right? That's one of the reasons why I did not mind working in the U.S. federal government. You're entitled to your job, right? So you're entitled to due process, and due process means the due process of the Fifth Amendment, because we're dealing with the federal government. If you're a state employee, and if the government that wants to take your state employment, then you applying the 14th Amendment, which has due process features as well. But for the federal government, right, then you would apply the Fifth Amendment due process, right? Due process means they have to give you a notice, right? They have to give you a notice of why, right, they want to take your job from you. By the way, so just cause, it would be for cause, it would mean that for severe misconduct or performance, right? And they would have to give you notice of your charges, give you notice first of all, and they have to give you an opportunity to examine the evidence. You have a right to examine the evidence and enough time to respond to why they shouldn't take your job, or to take corrective action, right? So you're entitled to due process. So in the federal government, if you're non-probationary, it's virtually impossible for them to fire you. There's a joke in the federal government that the only way you can be fired if if you're non-probationary in the yes, federal government, is if you literally kill somebody. That's the only way you can be fired, right? But the thing is, as President Trump then signed an executive order, right, saying, creating this Schedule F. It was called Schedule F. Now it's called Schedule P/C. That's policy / career. So that these people in mainly, it affects, by the way, senior leaders, people from GS15, right? Remember GS15, and maybe people in the senior executive service. People in the senior leaders, GS15, they're really high. It affects them that they can be removed, they can be fired. It converts about 8,000, almost 10,000 of them into at-will employees, right? If they are, people who are in policy, right? They're policy making, and it also affected mainly a lot of scientists were affected, right? Because there are many people who are on they're scientists, they're STEM in the federal government, but they have the protection of members of the competitive civil service. So again, I joined as a member of the competitive civil service. So you have protections. You're entitled to due process. Your job is an entitlement. You have a property interest in your position, right? So it's virtually almost impossible for you to be fired in the federal government. So they can't be fired. And one of the reasons the President Trump cites is that these people, right, from that GS15 level have constituted a deep state of federal employees, a deep state in the bureaucracy, right? The federal government. Is there one? I worked, right? I worked in the federal government, yes. I know there's a deep state, especially from these GS15, those people who have a property interest. So they create all sorts of, machinations, fraud, all sorts of stuff, and then they can't be punished because they've created a cabal, a cartel, and they are actually impugning the integrity of our federal civil service, and they can't be held accountable. They can't. So people who are going in, you either join them, right? You join them. They call themselves a family. That's what they were saying to me, right? When I was trying to, when I just got in, they were saying a family, and it's as if they test you by doing things that are illegal, first of all. And you know if they're testing you or not. And if you do not, right? If you do not, or you report the illegalities or whatever, then they can just, they could just fire you, and they create all sorts of funny inventions, right? And you need a legal force, right? Legal force, lots of money, right? To be a war chest that can hire all the lawyers, expensive lawyers in DC, right? To be able to challenge them. And unfortunately, the federal government has this army of lawyers that back the illegalities of these senior leaders that have constituted a deep state. So there's a lot of fraud, there's a lot of corruption, and we see it from what happened with the David J. Rush guy. Somebody let him in. It was somebody high up that let him in. And you see all the atrocities he was creating. He created fake programs. He was a member, he was even higher than a GS-15. A GS-15 is a senior leader. They're pretty high, right? They're one step wrong below the senior executive service. Senior executive service, they're the highest members of the U.S. Federal Civil Service. They're really high. They can earn as much as the Vice President of the United States. So they have a tremendous amount of authority. They're mapped to, even though they're civil servants, they're mapped equivalent to generals of the U.S. Army, right? So they're very high, and that's what you can see what this guy was doing. In the CIA, David Rush, he created fake programs in the CIA to funnel money to himself, and he recruits subordinates that he can just control, browbeat, to siphon money to himself from the U.S. government, millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars. Is he the only person who does it and who gets away with it? Absolutely not. I was a victim of a group that I cabal. They were committing fraud. I saw this elements of the fraud. I reported it. They retaliated, and you can't do anything. You're reporting it. You're wasting your time. But now with this executive order signed by President Trump, they can be removed easily, right? These people can be removed easily because even if they block them from one position, they'll just move to another portion of the civil service. They know how, they have enough money to hire lawyers. The lawyers protect them, and they can just undermine whatever investigation. So it's very difficult to hold them to account. But now with this creation of the Schedule P/C policy/career that basically converts these senior leaders, especially members of human resource. The human resources, that was what I found out in the Department of the Navy. They're extremely corrupt. In the Department of Defense, they are a cartel. They're the ones, and they do these things together with all the senior leaders. They are a corrupt cartel. They constitute a deep state. Somebody I have in mind, again, Kendra Tees. If you Google Kendra Tees, you'll see every time the numerous filings against her for misconduct, but she's still there, still committing crimes, and they can't do anything to her, right? That's because she probably has other people inside that are in management, other people committing worse crimes, and basically they bring in people who are going to be their allies, their subordinates, to continue to execute crimes, fraud against the American taxpayer, and violating the integrity of the United States system. So basically, that's the difference between employee at will and a non-probationary federal civil servant, right? They're protected by they have Fifth Amendment protections, and they have an entitlement to their job. And one of the court cases, I'll do later videos and discuss court cases as well that affirm this entitlement right. But Arnett versus Kennedy said that, well, the federal employee, non-probationary federal employee, has a property interest in their job, and they have, because the property interest gives them an entitlement. They're entitled to their job, and therefore they have due process rights as well. They can't take their jobs away from them except for just cause, as will improve the efficiency of the federal civil service. And that due process right they have, it gives them a right to know of their charges ahead of time, right to examine the evidence, and a fair time to a reasonable amount of time to respond, to challenge the evidence and the attempt to remove them from their job, right? So they have a property interest in their federal civil service job, and especially in the competitive service, right? So, but with this Schedule F or Schedule P/C that President Trump just signed into office on June the 3rd, it moves about 8,000 federal employees, especially the senior leaders. So it's management positions, right? Not the new people eager doing their jobs, but these management positions, they have now started to violate the rule of law. They now, they're cynical. They're not really doing their jobs well. They're now just committing all sorts of atrocities, and they feel bigger than their position. They've demonstrated it that they've really glorified themselves. They've become megalomaniacal in the federal civil service, and they have these big heads, huge egos. They're not serving the American people. They're using their office to commit fraud, and they're not held to account. They're not held to account. They're not accountable to anybody. And because they believe, they feel, well, they're entitled to their job. It's their property. They're not serving the American people or the interest of the United States. So they commit all sorts of atrocities. But at the same time, you can't remove them. It's virtually impossible to remove them, right? I remember when I was discussing, the fraud that some of these people, that I observed in the Navy, and I was telling the Auditor General of the Navy, and she knew they were committing fraud. What she said was, well, in the government, we don't remove people, but there are other ways to deal with them, but we don't remove people, we don't fire people in the federal government. Now things have changed, and these people can be fired, right? These people can be fired. There's a category of them, people in human resources, because the problems start with the people in the human resources. Kendra Ortiz is one of them. So they have this, let me not over personalize this, but again, the reason I'm discussing this is, or naming names, is because they're public servants, right? Servant means something. It underscores the fact that we serve the American people, we serve the taxpayers, we serve the Constitution, right? And the American people have a right to know what's going on in their government, to hold their public servants accountable. It's a public trust position we have, unfortunately. And when they're violating this public trust, the public should be able to know, Congress should know how to be able to remove these people from impugning the integrity of our government, and violating the U.S. Constitution, right? Which they do routinely, brazenly, without consequences, right? And unfortunately, new people who come in, they just have to join the bandwagon, right? They join the bandwagon, right? Or they get kicked out, they get sabotaged, they get lied on, they get defamed. Some might even get killed, right? I was lucky I wasn't killed, all right? They staged a swatting, instigated a swatting, a false flag, made it seem like it was a training process I was going through, and I was shot in the head. I have permanent scarring, permanent nerve damage, and I've been defamed. I was locked up wrongfully, all instigated and orchestrated by this cabal in the Department of the Navy, that feel they're above the law, right? They're not subject to the rule of law. They violate the laws of the Federal Civil Service and the U.S. Constitution. So I think it's a good thing that there's now a mechanism to hold senior leaders accountable, and they've been converted to employees at will. So I'll look at other cases that also address the property rights, the property interest of federal civil servants versus employees at will in the private sector. Interestingly, even though that the private sector, people don't have a right to their jobs, right, and they're employees at will, they're more effective and more efficient than people in the public sector who have a property interest in their jobs. So this probably will make these senior leaders more efficient, more effective. My name is Olurotimi Osha, and I will keep you posted. Thank you.